Princess Catherine had spent years learning to read those moments, and on one particular spring weekend, it was her daughter's expression that told her everything she needed to know. The gathering had been planned well in advance, a private luncheon at Windsor, organized around one of Queen Camilla's charitable commitments. These occasions were a familiar rhythm in the royal calendar. Catherine didn't resist these events, but she moved through them with awareness. While William could settle into the ease of his birthright, she had learned that her role demanded something more vigilant, something closer to watchfulness. Charlotte had arrived that morning quieter than usual, not defiant, not unwell, simply withdrawn. Her energy was turned inward, and for a girl who was naturally expressive and bright-eyed, that inwardness felt like a signal. Catherine noticed it before they even stepped through the doors. The children had been placed in a side salon for the early part of the afternoon. It was formal enough to satisfy protocol, but relaxed enough to let them breathe, their own small world alongside the adult gathering next door. Catherine had settled Charlotte into her seat, leaned down to kiss her forehead, and left the room. One last look back. Nothing unusual on the surface, but surfaces rarely told the whole story. Roughly 45 minutes later, Catherine caught a glimpse of her daughter through an open doorway across the corridor. Charlotte wasn't crying, but something about her had shifted. Her face had gone pale and tight. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line that no 7-year-old should ever have to wear. It was the look of a child who had been made to feel foolish. Catherine ended her conversation mid-thought and followed. She found Charlotte standing alone near the far end of the hallway, hands clasped, eyes cast down toward the floor. Catherine crouched to meet her gaze. "What happened, sweetheart?" A pause, then, "Nothing, Mommy." But Catherine had learned long ago that nothing almost always meant something. She waited, and finally, quietly, Charlotte spoke. Granny Camilla had told her not to speak unless she was asked to. Charlotte had answered a question in a game she and her cousins were playing, and Camilla had stepped in to correct her, not playfully, not warmly, pointedly. Catherine held her daughter for a long moment, her hand steady on Charlotte's back. She didn't rush to respond. Inside, something had shifted in her too. She had always tried to maintain a graceful distance from the friction that occasionally surfaced in their relationship with Camilla. She understood that the queen consort operated according to her own sense of hierarchy, her own idea of how a young royal should carry herself. Camilla's standards had been formed in a different era, and Catherine had long chosen to absorb the occasional edge in her remarks rather than escalate. She had never imagined those edges would be directed at her children. She was wrong to assume that. Later in the afternoon, at the refreshment table, Catherine watched Camilla glance at Charlotte reaching for a second scone and issue a quiet, half-smiling remark about moderation, about not appearing greedy. The tone was light enough to be deniable, gentle enough to dismiss, but Catherine had heard it, and she recognized what it was: a pattern. A single comment could be written off as habit or obliviousness, but two in one afternoon, both targeted at the same child, both designed to diminish rather than correct, were something else. Catherine didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for her husband. She simply observed, quietly, building a complete picture. William hadn't caught any of it. He had spent most of the afternoon with Charles and the senior staff, deep in discussion about upcoming schedules. That evening, back at Adelaide Cottage, after the children were settled, Catherine sat across from him and told him everything, not with emotion driving the words, with precision. She laid out each moment, what was said, how Charlotte had looked, what Charlotte had told her in the hallway. When she finished, William was quiet for a beat. Then, "That's not something we ignore." Catherine agreed, but she also understood that how they responded mattered as much as the response itself. No scenes, no public accusations. Clarity delivered carefully and without apology. The following week, when Charlotte was due to appear at a Camilla-organized event with several of the royal grandchildren, Catherine arranged for her to stay home. A vague mention of a mild cold was offered to the household. The real reason didn't need to be stated. Word reached Camilla. She raised an eyebrow, made an offhand comment to one of her staff about Charlotte perhaps being too fragile for a bit of fresh air.
That comment made its way back through the household networks that always carried more than they were meant to. Catherine filed it away. The situation might have existed only in quiet arrangements and unspoken adjustments, if not for what happened the following weekend. It was a small family dinner at Highgrove, meant to feel relaxed. Charles had invited the Waleses, hoping the proximity and the familiar grounds would smooth things over naturally. The agenda was light: family time, conversation about upcoming engagements. Charlotte came to the door of the main lounge just before her bedtime to say goodnight to her grandfather. She had dressed neatly, smiled politely, and greeted the room with the ease of a child who has been taught that small courtesies matter. Camilla, seated near the fireplace, barely looked up. Then, "Are you certain you're not too tired to be here?" It was said with a kind of amused lightness, as if it were a passing thought, but it landed differently than that. It landed like a dismissal, like Charlotte's presence was more inconvenient than welcome. Catherine was standing just a few feet away. She heard it. She saw the color shift in Charlotte's face. This time, she didn't wait for later. She turned to Charlotte with quiet composure. "Why don't you say goodnight to Glam and up with Anna?" Charlotte looked at her mother for a half-second, reading something in her stillness, then moved to Charles, hugged him, and left the room with the nanny. The door closed. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Camilla settled back into her chair, a murmur half to no one. "She is quite sensitive, isn't she?" William went very still. Charles shifted in his seat. Catherine stepped forward. "She isn't too sensitive," Catherine said. The words came out evenly, without sharpness or performance. "She is a child, and she deserves to be addressed with the same kindness that any child does." Camilla looked up. "I didn't intend it that way. I was simply noting the hour." "Tonight wasn't the issue," Catherine replied. "What's happened over the past few weeks is. I've heard the remarks, so has she. She told me herself." Charles began to speak. Catherine let him start, then continued. "If it had been a single moment, we wouldn't be here, but it's a pattern, and I won't continue pretending otherwise, not when it involves Charlotte." Camilla's reply was measured. She had been misread, she said. Children bounce back. Perhaps Catherine was too close to it to be objective. "Children carry what they're told," Catherine answered, "especially by the people who are supposed to love them without conditions." There was nothing left to respond to after that. The words sat in the room with a weight that required no elaboration. William spoke briefly. His message was simple and unambiguous. Basic respect for Charlotte wasn't a request, it was an expectation. Camilla said nothing further. Charles chose not to push. Catherine excused herself, walked upstairs, and sat beside her daughter's bed. She didn't ask Charlotte how she was feeling. She simply held her hand. "You did nothing wrong today," she said. "You walked in, you were gracious, and you said goodnight. That's everything I ask of you." Charlotte, half asleep, nodded against her pillow. "You don't have to shrink yourself for anyone," Catherine added quietly. Downstairs, Charles tried to redirect the evening towards lighter topics. Camilla participated, though with noticeably less ease than usual. No apology was offered, but the defense had also stopped. Later that evening, alone with William, Catherine was composed but tired in the way that comes from holding your ground in a place where the ground keeps moving. "She doesn't have to be fond of me," Catherine said. "That was never the expectation, but she will treat Charlotte with the same respect she'd want shown to any child in this family."
William looked at her steadily. "She will, because we won't allow anything else." The adjustments that followed were quiet but unmistakable to those inside the household. Charlotte's school recital at Lambrook was held as an intimate family occasion. Camilla was not included. The official explanation noted a scheduling conflict. Nothing more was said publicly. At subsequent joint appearances, Camilla kept her commentary focused elsewhere. The offhand observations about the children's manners, their energy, their presence, stopped. Whether that came from genuine reflection or simply from recognizing a boundary she could no longer cross without consequence, Catherine neither knew nor needed to know. What mattered was the result. The summer gathering at Balmoral brought the families back together as they always did.
The Scottish estate had belonged to the rhythm of royal summers for generations, a place designed for long walks and long silences, for stepping back from the formal machinery of public life. Charles loved it deeply. The children flourished in the open air. Catherine came with her eyes open. She had told William clearly before they arrived, Charlotte would not be left alone with Camilla. Not again. Not yet. He agreed without argument. The first few days carried genuine ease. Charlotte began to return to herself, chattering at breakfast, racing George and Louis across the grounds, appearing one afternoon in the kitchen with flour on her hands after helping bake scones. It was the Charlotte Catherine had been watching for, the one who hadn't been there since spring. Then came the afternoon when a household aide found her way to the drawing room where Catherine was sitting with guests. She leaned in gently, her voice low. Charlotte was in the sunroom with the Queen Consort. Catherine was on her feet before the aide had finished the sentence. She walked toward the sunroom with a measured pace, pausing just before the door. Through it, she heard Camilla's voice. "We don't need to speak over others, Charlotte. Listening is a quality worth developing. Your mother sometimes struggles with that herself." Silence from Charlotte. Catherine opened the door. Camilla looked up, eyebrows raised slightly. "There you are, love," Catherine said to Charlotte, her voice entirely steady. Charlotte crossed the room immediately and stood at her side. "I was just having a word with her," Camilla offered, her tone sliding toward breezy. "I heard." Catherine met her eyes. She wasn't interrupting anyone. She was simply in the room. Camilla began. "I was only—" "She doesn't need to be corrected for existing." Catherine's voice remained calm, but nothing in her expression left room for negotiation. "I'd appreciate it if she were treated with warmth. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask." Camilla didn't answer. Catherine guided Charlotte into the hallway, knelt beside her and spoke quietly. "You did nothing wrong." Charlotte's eyes were bright and wet at the edges. "I know, Mommy." "You never need to make yourself smaller, not for anyone." By the end of the week at Balmoral, the staff had registered the change in dynamics without needing it explained. Meal arrangements were organized with a bit more distance. The children came and went freely without commentary. Camilla focused her attention on Charles and on the adult conversations that had always been more comfortable ground for her anyway. Catherine hadn't demanded anything dramatic. She had simply made it clear, with every measured word and deliberate silence, that there was a line, and that it had already been crossed enough. Even Charles, who genuinely loved both women and wanted only for things to be smooth, understood that this particular tension had resolved itself in only one direction. Catherine had drawn the boundary, and she would hold it. The family photographs from that summer were as warm and unified as any that had come before. Charlotte smiled in every one of them. Real smiles, bright and unbothered, the kind that don't require any effort to manufacture. Behind those photographs, one mother made a quiet, firm, and permanent decision that her daughter's confidence was not a sacrifice she was willing to make for anyone's comfort, not even in a family built entirely around the performance of unity. She would protect the smile in those photographs, whatever it took to keep it there. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Do you think there's a generational clash at the heart of all this, or something more deliberate? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories from behind the palace walls.